So yeah, this is a film about a book, about a film, about a book. Sort of, kinda. Cheers. Welcome back everybody to me talking about books, and today we will be talking about The Seventh Veil of Salome by Silvia Moreno Garcia. And I am very excited about this, but first, thanks to those of you who have sent me some money. I have a new computer, so there will be new videos coming out relatively quickly, but yeah, this one is very much for you. Thanks so very much. Cheers. And now let's get to the main video. What we'll do is the usual thing. I'll give you a quick synopsis rundown of like why you should go and read this book, which you should, and then I'll have a little bit more beer and we'll talk about the spoilers and stuff afterwards, which is sort of like your signal to go and read the book, or just accept that from there on out there will be spoilers. You have seen this happen before, I assume, so let's get started, right? So, The Seventh Veil of Salome is a historical fiction on two layers. It is about a movie. One of those classic 1950s Hollywood biblical sandal movies, epic movies of the sort that usually had Charlton Heston do something stupid somewhere. Anyway, it is about that, and that movie is called The Seventh Veil of Salome, and is about, well, the story of Salome, which you may know from the Bible if probably you know it from some other place, but it's, you know, the girl that dances and then gets the head of John the Baptist as a reward. So that's the basic storyline. It focuses on the 1950s, on the making of the movie, and on characters that are involved with that movie. Those being two actresses, one who is cast as Salome and is a brand new Mexican actress that has never starred in any big movie or anything before, and is brought into Hollywood as the new girl, basically. And the other one, Nancy, being an older actress that has been around in Hollywood for a while and is only playing a small extra role in this movie. And it's about how they engage with the Hollywood system, with all the stuff that happens around there. It gets like very dark. I mean, if you've known anything about 1950s Hollywood, you can imagine that there will be sexism, and there will be racism, and there will be, well, hatred of communists, and there will be homophobia, and the Hays Code is still going on, and all of that stuff, which plays a role in this story. And then there is, of course, another storyline, and that is the story of Salome all the way back 2,000 years ago, roughly. So we have these two storylines, and they're interwoven, and they reflect on each other, and so forth. And then we also have some sort of like first-person samples of other people involved, a bit like interview snippets of people that are also involved with the production of that movie, the director, the scriptwriter, those kind of people, right? So we have all of that, and all of this comes together in a beautiful story that has all the atmosphere of the Hollywood high drama of the 1950s, that you could probably just take and turn into a film right now if you want to. And yeah, it's incredibly entertaining, it's incredibly well written, it is a fast read, and it's incredibly exciting. And yet, you can learn a lot about storytelling and history from it as well, which is what we'll talk about once you have read the book, which you definitely should do. I'll have a bit of a beer, and then we'll talk about spoilers and what makes this book so wonderful for me. Alright, got it? Read it? Perfect. I hope you enjoyed it. And now let's talk about some of the things that I think make this remarkable in a lot of ways. So, let's start talking about historical fiction and the present. See, this is technically historical fiction. It's set in the 1950s, mostly, and then also in the time of John the Baptist and Jesus, the historical Jesus, and so forth. We have those two storylines, but the main focus is the 1950s. And it deals with a lot of things that you may recognize are relevant today. See, that's the point. History, any form of history, whether it's historical fiction or historiography, always says a lot more about the present of the author than it does usually about the actual sort of truth of, the time that it's portraying. That is just because we always see everything through the lens of our own situation, and there's a limited amount of data that we actually have and can prove when it comes to history, just like the sources that we have from back then, so to speak. So, this is very much a book about today, and you will probably understand why. See, our main character here, Vera, the main actress, is Mexican, and she has to deal with a lot of racism towards people from Latin America, from South America, Latine people, which, you know, may sound familiar in the now, right? It's not like there's an ongoing panic about migrants coming from the South to America. This has obviously not really changed, and a lot of these quotes that were used by, you know, some actresses versus towards Vera in this book are eerily familiar if you looked at you know, current political events. And I think that is for a good reason, because, yeah, these things, racism has been around for a long time, so it obviously shows up here. The same is obviously the topic of sexism. Now, once again, there is a lot of sexism and misogyny in this book. There's also sexual violence, sexual harassments, and we kind of know that this is still ongoing in the media sphere, right? Me Too is not exactly gone. We have currently a lot of accusations against media figures of basic men basically just taking for granted the availability of female bodies and yeah, dehumanizing them and so forth. So obviously this being in here is another part that is obviously present in the now and then, in the now as well as it was then in the 1950s. Which we'll come back to later. The same goes slightly for homophobia. There is obviously the idea that well, obviously homosexuality in the 1950s is not exactly legal, and there's a lot of persecution, and the idea that there are obviously gay men and potentially obviously also lesbian actresses, and the way that they have to worry about being outed and leave Hollywood for a while when there is danger of that, to have it blow over and so forth. All of that part of that systemic homophobia is obviously something, once again, that we still kind of have. Obviously, nowadays, it's not necessarily just straight up homosexuality, although there's still plenty of homophobia going on. It's, you know, stuff like transphobia coming, replacing part of that. But the idea of basically denigrating, hating, torturing, and whatnot, abusing and exploiting marginalized people, it's still around, right? So once again, this is a lot of this stuff feels eerily familiar in that regard. Then there's of course the whole idea of people with communist sympathies being persecuted. This is right around the McCarthy era of the Red Scare and so forth. So this is another part which may not be as clear right now. Being a Marxist does not necessarily get you banned from Hollywood, I guess, but certainly there's enough like rhetoric going on around, you know, cultural Marxist, critical race theory, all these other things that are somewhat political that can lead to being, or at least leads to a lot of efforts of being blacklisted and so forth. So once again, the time of the 1950s that this describes is eerily familiar to anyone right now. And that makes sense, because if you look at, you know, current politics, a lot of, you know, people on the reactionary right want to move back to the 1950s. Now, the question is obviously what's the difference between then and now? And I feel the largest part is that the time of the 1950s, all the things that we still have was there, but you didn't get shit for it. Nowadays, there is at least the understanding that, you know, misogyny is bad. We kind of have accepted it, luckily. And we have accepted that racism is bad. A lot of people are still racist and misogynist and so forth, but they get some form of backlash, at least right now. And I think that's sort of the thing we can see is that while the acts of marginalization have not changed as much as you might wish, at least there is some form of sanction for it now. And I feel seeing that is one of the important parts here. It's like, it's not as... there are consequences for these kinds of actions now, not as much consequence as we may wish, but they are there. So this is the first part that I wanted to talk about, how historical fiction always says a lot about the situation we are in right now, the present, obviously. And this book does that in a lot of ways. Now, there are more elements here that I think are worth talking about, and these are, of course, the depiction of these different classes, these different groups that we have to talk about here. See, all our characters here come from very specific backgrounds, from very specific different backgrounds. I feel the main, I'll mostly focus on the 1950s part. We'll talk about the historical Salome later. We have Vera Larios, who comes from a middle class, upper middle class background in Mexico. We have Nancy, who is, well, a struggling actress, to put it mildly, with a background in show business through her father. She kind of embodies the sort of like half-life, half-world sort of part that made Hollywood the thing that it was at the time, sort of always on the gray area between, crime and struggles, and there's obviously sex work involved in there as well. And we have, of course, Jay Rutland, who is, East Coast elite, to put it mildly, right? His father is the owner of a large company, and he comes from that very specific East Coast elite, and he's over there. So we have these three different parts of the society, and we can see how each of them has its own codes, how some of them, and how these sort of restrictive codes make it very difficult to communicate. The first part is, of course, Vera's background and internalized racism and internalized white supremacy. See, Vera obviously struggles with a lot of expectations. Her family, mostly her mother in this regard, are trying to get her to, conform to very specific expectations. And all of these expectations are made to sort of conform as much as possible to an idea of, in this case, largely whiteness. Vera has darker skin than her sister, which is why her mother prefers her sister. It's about taking all the negative and racist stereotypes about Mexicans and trying to, as much as possible, to not even get close to these racist stereotypes. Instead of, developing like an own identity, it's very much trying to conform to ideas of whiteness in this regard. And I think this is an important part that I can't speak more to because, I'm a white boy from Germany. What the fuck do I know about this? But it's my thoughts that I had while reading the book in this regard. Is like how so much of this is internalized, trying to be not like the white people think we are, or think this family is, or Mexicans are in general, and that's pretty toxic in a lot of ways. On the other hand, that also comes with, because this perpetuates those forms of oppression in a lot of ways, because it means looking down on every other lower class people from Mexico, lower class Latine people, for, representing all these things that you have, that the upper class, the upper middle class has sort of internalized as negative stereotypes, and that's not a good thing, is my point here. So that's the first group here. Then we have, of course, Jay Rutland and the East Coast elites, which are all about very specific forms of behavior. It's like, studying at Princeton. He studies at Princeton. Playing jazz, definitely out. You play classical music or nothing, and then you don't become a musician. You actually work in the family, do the family business, and so forth. And that is just as constricted an environment and group of people as anything else. Now, you can argue whether the East Coast elites in this regard are sort of struggling under the problem that the United States don't have the form of aristocracy that, say, England has. And there's always this feeling of inferiority in that regard. So you still internalize certain forms of classism and self-hatred in that regard, and try to be something, hold up to some sort of weird external or internalized image of being better, being more refined, and so forth. And clearly these behavioral models are modeled after like mostly British aristocracy. And so once again we have this idea of trying to live someone else's story, which is what we will come back to near the end. So this is interesting to see that, and the way that both mothers, both Vera's and Jay's mother, do sort of dictate and try to make their children conform to these expectations, I think is important in the way it is mirrored. Now let's talk about Nancy for a second. And I think what is interesting here is that Nancy is the clearest in having an idea of who she wants to be and what her story is. That is obviously becoming a Hollywood star and living the life of a Hollywood star in the 1950s, and with all that entails. But because she has been in this sort of half-world. Her father, being first a show star, and then now he's a bookie, and always part of this very specific crowd of like, the show business and adjacent spheres of Hollywood. This half-world where stuff is faster and looser than it may be in both the worlds that Vera and Jay come from. But it still has very specific expectations and rules, and Nancy lives these rules once again. She dresses up the way she thinks she has to dress up. She invents these kind of stories that she has to sort of build around her career and so forth. But once again, there are external factors that that she has to labor under. And in this case, it's her father telling her why she is not good enough, why she has not, succeeded in show business, which is the thing he wants her to succeed in, by doing hard work and so forth. So once again, we have basically three people that are laboring under external expectations of how to behave according to the social group they belong to. Each of these in being embodied by either their mothers or their father. And I think this is very important, because a lot of this is about storytelling, obviously. So that, I think, is the next important part here. Now let's move on. And let's talk about Salome, because we haven't yet. See, Salome's story is interwoven with the other two main stories and all these like snippets from the press and so forth. And there's something interesting going on here. And Silvia Moreno Garcia does mention that there's very little in the actual textual sources about Salome beyond her, being the adopted daughter or whatever of Herod Antipater. We get the name from Flavius Josephus, and we have obviously the bit about the dance in the Bible, in one of the Gospels. But most of the imagery that we have of Salome is later. It's storytelling by other people. It's there's operas, there's texts by French 19th century authors and so forth. There's paintings of the weird dance, the dance of the seven veils, and all of that stuff. So we have a lot of stories about Salome. But there is very little to nothing that we could call the actual story of that person. So once again, what happens here is with the movie that is created, that Max Niemann creates, that Vera Larios is acting in as Salome, that all the other people around her are sort of tied to. I think we can see how the way that movie sort of develops changes or influences the way Salome's story happens at the same time. And I think this is a very interesting tool. It reminded me of The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov, because there is the novel about the life of Pontius Pilate, and we have these parts of the novel that may also just be the actual things that happened back in those facts, and we can see how that art gets the story right. In Bulgakov, obviously, Master Margarita goes into very different places later on, but the idea that art does actually portray some form of truth, and how art changes, that also may change the truth if there was ever any truth behind it. So seeing the story sort of shift and adapt to the movie as it also lives out Vera and Nancy and Jay and the others sort of live out their drama. We have these three layers. We have the movie, we have the story of Salome, and we have the events around the actors and actresses, and they all come together at the end, and we see how these roles change in that, right? We have, for example, obviously, at the end of the day, Nancy is far closer to the traditional story of Salome, in that she actually seduces someone to kill someone for her. Now, obviously, she wants Vera dead, but she gets Jay Rutland instead. But this is very much the John the Baptist being beheaded, basically, story. On the other hand, we have Vera being much closer to John the Baptist in the story, when she defies all these expectations and does her own thing, and by sheer determination and by the sheer embodiment of her will, does actually impress and portray some form of truth that was not there in the way that, it would have been if she had followed just the director's well, directions. So we have these sort of like shifts, how people in this basic story sort of shift their roles in a lot of ways. And I think this is something that we'll come back to at the end, because this is a story about making your own story, is where I think we will land. And this is very much, I think, the power here, because all of these people want to live a story. All we as humans want is to live stories. We tell stories about ourselves, we tell stories about our lives and so forth, but it is important to find out whether these are stories that we think other people would tell about us, or if these are stories that we want to tell about ourselves. And in this regard, I think the structure is interesting, because we have these three main viewpoints. We have Nancy's, we have Vera's, and we have Salome's viewpoint. But we also have people telling stories about them. We have Joe, the scriptwriter. We have Max, the director. We have other people they come across. Then we, of course, have the Hollywood, is it Connection or something? You know, the very... the yellow press telling stories about Vera, full of, you know, racism and all the other stuff. We have all these people telling stories around them, and we can see how our main characters either try to conform to these tales, or try to go against these trends and these stories and these tales. And I think this is where I want to end with this. I think this is a story about stories. This is a story about not living someone else's story, about finding out who you really want to be, and then turning the world and turning the story, writing the story about yourself, writing yourself into the story that you want, which is why Vera at the end becomes a musician and not an actress, which is unfortunately why Nancy ends up the way she ends up. And let's be real, a lot of this is about systemic oppression in a lot of ways. Nancy suffers from the same misogyny that Vera suffers from, but because she has certain advantages by, you know, for example, being white and so forth, she can then also still continue to oppress Vera in other ways. On the other hand, you have men taking advantage of Nancy. We have, it's a mess, because capitalism and racism and misogyny all intersect in this very specific way, and very, very little of this has changed, but we all have the power to change it for ourselves, at least a little, and we need to grab that power. And I think that's at the core of this story that makes it so powerful, so empowering for me, is that it is about reclamation, about taking back stories, taking back the narratives and telling these kind of stories. So having a story about Mexican and non-white actors and actresses in Hollywood in the 1950s, which are confined to very specific stories, and we have those in the conversations, right? The singing gaucho, and I keep forgetting her name, the Brazilian actress and singer, and people trying to figure out whether they can afford to break those rules, break those narratives or not, because there are external factors, because, you know, you maybe have to pay for your child or do other things to avoid losing your economic basis. So we have all these elements in there. And what makes the story so strong is that Vera and Salome in the originals, in the now new tale of Salome, that is the past story of Salome, which, you know, is a bit complicated, is that they buck the trend, that they decide to live their truth and do what they want to do and not give in to the story. And that's empowering in a lot of ways. It ends semi-tragic, because this is, at the end of the day, a tragedy using the same modes of Hollywood high drama of the 1950s and 60s. So there has to be tragedy, but there is strength in there. There is success in just surviving can be sometimes success, and not giving in to letting other people define you can be success. And in that regard, it is a triumph, and I really appreciated that. So yeah, this is a rather convoluted way of me telling you why I think this is a brilliant book and you should go and read it. If you have read it, let me know what you think about it, what you thought about it, what your ideas are. And I don't know, like, subscribe, comment, I don't know, there's a Patreon if you want to give me money. You don't have to. Mostly just, I don't know, read the book, watch the video, share it with a friend, and I don't know, let's have a conversation about it, because this was surprisingly good. So anyway, I'll see you very soon with another video, and until then, thanks, and Cheers.